So it's a joy to be here with you, John, on a Saturday afternoon.
Indeed.
So for those of you that don't know, John and I have known each other for quite a while and are working on a book together right now, which I think is part of what sparked this idea that we would have a conversation together, a book that will come out about a year from now. So it's a really fun opportunity for me to ask a lot of questions that are on my mind, and so I'm happy for us to all go on this journey together of talking and getting to know John's work a little bit better. I thought it would be good to start sort of way back, and for those of the people in the audience who maybe don't know your work that well, your bio, when you go to Wikipedia, I was struck. It's the beginning part of the bio on Wikipedia, you know, the little intro part that's usually like a paragraph or so long on Wikipedia. John says, John Beech is a British-American artist who lives in Brooklyn, New York. That's the whole thing. Which seems fitting. I mean, I think of you as a minimalist. That seems kind of fitting. It also goes on to go into a lot of detail about John's rather remarkable career and the exhibitions, the collections of the different museums. But I'm curious if we go back there a little bit and just start at where this began, how you decided to be an artist, what your background is.
Sure. And thank you, Charlotte, for the exhibition. I'm happy to be here in lovely Santa Fe. I did not write my own Wikipedia entry. I should just let that be known. Yes, I grew up in England, southern England, Winchester, and we moved to California in the early 80s. My father was working in the computer industry, so we were sucked into Silicon Valley, and we had actually had a little time in the States. My father had been posted at times when I was younger, but was permanently in the States at age 17, 1981. And quite a big cultural shift, change for me there, from the bucolic English landscape in Winchester Cathedral to a kind of more horizontal kind of Western United States. And I fell in with some good friends when I first got there, people I still know.
And you went to Berkeley, right? So
yes, I had a year of high school down the peninsula around Palo Alto, and then went up to Berkeley, and I was undeclared, which was one of the great things about coming to the States. You didn't really have to throw yourself in one direction at an early age. So I basically went into Berkeley undeclared, trying to avoid math and physics as much as I could. I somehow put myself through calculus, which was a challenge. And I ended up doing both art and architecture. I moved first into the architecture department, which is where I also first did some printing of photographs. I did a photography class in that department. But as time went on, I realized I was more of an artist, really, and I started being more in Krober Hall across the way from Worcester, the architecture department. But I effectively did a double major, but I didn't do all there was some kind of structural classes and things like that in the architecture department, which I didn't quite fulfill.
Architecture makes a whole lot of sense. Actually, I didn't know that. That's amazing. We're going to get there, but before we do, there's a really interesting essay, and there's been several books already on John's work. One of the books that was done with the Kunst in St. Joseph in Germany. There's a great essay by
Switzerland. That one.
Switzerland. Actually. Okay. There's a great essay by Kenneth Baker in the front of that, and he says he thinks of you as being a sculptor in everything you do. What do you think of that?
Well, I'm going to say I like that. I think of myself as an artist and works in a lot of different media and ways, but I think there is a kind of physicality and presence that I'm interested in, probably more than a overt narrative. It's more somehow about this objects. So yeah, I think there is a sculptural feeling to most of what I do, whether it's on the wall or freestanding or the photographs. People have commented that they feel sculptural as well in the way they're handled.
And going that far back, have you always worked in so many different media? Has that been sort of consistent from the beginning?
I started out really as a painter at Berkeley, and I had David Simpson, one of my professors there, who shows with Charlotte, and still living in the Bay Area. And what happened actually was I was making some sculpture at Berkeley, but primarily making paintings, and then I moved over to San Francisco, and I was working as a house painter part-time, and I found that when I was working in the evenings on paintings, I was having a tendency to destroy what I'd done the day before. There wasn't really enough continuity for painting somehow, and so I began to be doing things that were a bit more physical and sculptural. They seemed like they survived one day to the next a little bit more for when I could get back to it, and that I really was more definitely a sculptor through the 90s, but in the last couple of decades I've brought painting back a lot more, and I think also on top of the photographs, of course.
Yeah, I think for me there's as much or more than any artist that I know well, there's a consistent vision of the way that you look at things, even though you're seemingly constantly changing, whether that's three-dimensional work or two-dimensional work or based in photography or now monotypes or printmaking. And one of the things that I think in that same essay that Kenneth wrote, he quotes a Nabokov quote that I wrote down. It says, "We unfairly insult things in our inattentiveness." He talks about how touching is the molding on the ceiling that we never look at. And Kenneth takes that quote, because I think this digs into something that's really interesting about the way that you think about working, and says that for decades, John Beech has scavenged within the zone of neglect that Nabokov writes about, lavishing attention on some of the belittled, sidelined furniture of our material, mental, and civic lives. How does that strike you, and what did you think when?
Well, it's hard to follow that sentence. That's pretty good from Kenneth. Kenneth Baker was the leading writer on minimalism. He wrote the book about the lightning field, Walter de Maria, and he was an early supporter of my work because he felt that I was one of the first minimalists that had shown up in San Francisco. This was around about 1990 or so. Not that I was more of a post-minimalist, of course, but he hadn't really seen more stripped down work in the Bay Area, and since that was his great love, he was kind of happy to come across me. I had done some works using rubber car mats on the floor that were reminiscent of some Carl Andre type work, and Kenneth, he wrote something like redolent of the road for that, which I thought was okay. But sorry, what was the question, David?
Okay, so there's really there's two things in there that I want to talk about.
Yeah.
One, you sort of referenced immediately, which is this idea of minimalism, which I think that if people look around the room, they don't immediately think of you as a minimalist, but I do think of you as a minimalist, and I think that's, we are sitting in Charlotte Jackson's gallery, and I think sometimes people look at this work and they don't. So that's one question. Let's talk a little bit about minimalism. And then there's another inherent question about everyday objects, ordinary objects, this sort of way in which you look at things that have been maybe overlooked or not recognized. But let's start with minimalism.
Well, minimalism, and I know the artists that loosely get categorized in that camp. No one really liked that term because it seemed to be a simplification, and those artists like Judd or Serra or Sandbeck, very different kinds of work, David Rabinowitz, but there's a property of presence and stillness, and I think contemplative insight kind of power that work really was about. That was kind of the original new feeling that came from that work within the larger picture of modern art. You could say that there's a lot of examples from older or even primitive art of that kind of presence. You think of Neolithic art or that kind of thing. But I think that was always something I was very drawn to, this kind of presence and meditative work, not really charging at you with a big narrative, but more something you could feel your way into. So kind of an intuitive relationship to it.
Yeah, I think about reduction, or in your case, often you're reducing things, or you're highlighting certain objects, certain things, but you're also taking things away. That idea that minimalism is about reducing down to the lowest minimal sort of content. Is it something you think about consciously? Is it part of your process, or is it just a natural sort of tendency?
Well, that's a good point about the sort of taking things out being a kind of minimal gesture. I don't know that I don't really think of myself as being any particular kind of artist, I suppose, because I like to surprise myself and not entirely have a strategy. So I would say, though, the way that I link into more classic minimal work is I have an appreciation for simple forms, but I felt a need to attach that to a kind of utility, a kind of familiar objects, which is in part how I landed upon the use of dumpsters as a little bit of a classic sort of example of this. It's you could say they're minimal forms, containers, geometric, apparently industrially made. But they're clearly for a purpose, and it's clearly a purpose that we've all agreed upon. That we do need somewhere to get rid of stuff, and these mobile containers are useful for this. But they just happen to also have these aesthetic properties that relate to minimalism and the kind of presence in place. So I think I was trying to combine a more abstract kind of notion of minimalism with a kind of more utilitarian, vernacular kind of familiar objects. It was the same with the rubber car mats. And something that people feel engaged with. And that's why I've ended up doing a lot of, well, there's actually several reasons for, this was just one of the reasons why I have done a lot of photographs of dumpsters and other street debris. But yeah, there are some other reasons actually.
It's like you've somehow made dumpsters into sculpture, or sculpture from dumpsters, or that there's this translation that they've become solitary Judd-like objects in a way that they're sort of invisible objects, I think, in our world. I mean, I don't think that people necessarily think or talk a lot about dumpsters in that way. I mean, one of the things I wrote down here is why dumpsters?
Okay, well, yeah, it's a pretty decent question since we're surrounded by rather a lot of them here, and it is actually just a part of the work that I do. But I came to dumpsters from what I just said, an interest in minimalism, but also I had arrived in New York by '96, and I got a camera, a film camera in '97, and I was just photographing the environment. And where I was living, Greenpoint was pretty gritty and industrial, still is to some degree, and I would be going around on my bike or in my car and just photographing the environment. And I came across, it's actually one of the pieces around the corner, the faux brick dumpster was actually in Midtown Manhattan. And that one really got me going on taking photos of dumpsters, because that one had this attempt to camouflage it against a brick wall. It was as if it was saying, I know you really don't want to see me, and I'm aware, I'm self-conscious of my presence, so I'm doing my best to be unnoticeable. And the fact is that dumpsters are everywhere, and they're kind of in the way, and they generally are in that category of work, of things in the world that we perhaps try to, unconsciously we overlook, and we perhaps edit out of our environment. Although perhaps there are people like me, and many in fact who might quite enjoy looking at them, but there is a sense of a necessity, and they're ubiquitous. And I have a photo of, well, the Queen is no longer alive, but I had the Queen's dumpster around the back of Buckingham Palace, and many other around the world. So there's a sense of them being everywhere, and we're all kind of engaging with them. So I think that familiarity, almost a kind of pop feeling about them, was another thing that drew me to using that image a lot. And further, I should say, it turns out when you actually examine dumpsters, there's a huge range of types, and often they're a little bit more handmade and painted and unique than you might assume at first. And for instance, if it's a fairly geometric form, but there's some wheels, there's some handles, there's some bars for lifting them, and they also kind of appear and disappear mysteriously. They can be right there in front of your building, and then at one point you didn't notice it go, but it's gone off. So yeah, they're really a part of our world, wherever you are in the world.
It strikes me in hearing you talk about that I'm really curious about how photography became such a critical part of this. Because, I mean, in one way of thinking, dumpsters could have been an influence on you in terms of the sculpture that you made or the paintings that you made. But you've actually chosen, I mean, I think that the photographs, I know that some of the photographs that you used early on were found photographs, but a lot of the photography, and I think all the photography in this room now, is based on your photography. So it's not just that you're manipulating this concept of a dumpster, you're thinking about it, but you're also starting from a place of photography. And I've heard you talk about photographs that have texture are what's interesting to you. And so I'm curious as to how all that plays.
Well, some of the early smaller pieces that we have here from 97 or so, I was thinking of them as ways to work out ideas a little bit. So I would do some annotation on them, and I had worked as an installer when I was in San Francisco at the museum, San Francisco MoMA, and they had a great photo collection, and there were some works, and I don't remember actually who the photographer was, but there were some early landscapes that had handwritten notes on them that were very, very beautiful. I remember when I was seeing those thinking, yeah, there's just something about a photo and then something directly on top that it's a kind of immediacy that somehow stays with it. You know the photo is a moment in time, but there's something about something on top seems to stay in the present. So I think, yeah, there was some interest in using the photos as annotated drawings a little bit, and
They're like your sketches in a way. I mean, they're
Yeah.
the way you're thinking about. Are you thinking about sculpture when you're thinking about them in that way?
Well, I was, yeah, these were works from a while ago, and I was making, it had begun actually in San Francisco, but I was making sculpture that were effectively container-type pieces. They were a little bit like a Judd-type work that was obviously more utilitarian. So they were, in fact, idea places for me to, like a repository of thinking on these drawings, rather than just on a blank bit of paper. It would be on top of a photo. Sometimes they were just describing, naming what was in the photo, like, oh, here's a loading dock, or that kind of thing. And just coloring out the loading dock part. But it was also what you were saying about the sculptural feeling. I was interested in those works being tactile and having a little bit of a sculptural feeling.
Yeah, it's just before we started this conversation, my husband, Trey, who's here, who is an architect, was talking about how these objects almost become buildings, that you're taking objects and turning them into something. There's that note that you made that you studied architecture in undergrad. There's architecture in this. It's not, I think it's sort of twisted. It's why I think some of the photographs remind me of things like Burned and Hilla Becker, because there is sort of this, you're taking the everyday object of the dumpster, repeating it over and over and again, and there's sort of this architectural thinking, but it's twisted into something that's different.
Well, their work, which is fantastic, but very different from mine in that they really studied and got the light quality that they wanted for each piece to have a kind of consistency. And I was always going much more from a kind of street photo, quick shooting approach, just gathering material more than really trying to get perfect photographs. The same with the printing of the photos. I was trying to just generate a lot of material. Sometimes they would be underexposed, and that wasn't necessarily a problem. That might make for an interesting piece in its own way. But photography, it really took off for me when I moved to New York, because I think I really was trying to feel at home, although it is a place you feel quickly at home. And I did feel at home, but I guess it was an investigation of what this new home was.
There's also, for me, one of the things for the time that I've spent in your studio, I think sometimes talking to artists, there's almost an impediment that comes from knowledge of art history, of other artists, of other things. I won't go that way because it looks like Judd, or I won't go that way because it looks like Brendan Hillebecker. You know, there's that sort of, and there's something about your work. You have this sort of very liberated sort of mutability. You're willing to go into monotypes from paintings, from photography to three-dimensional. Is that something you're conscious of, or is it just natural in the process?
Well, I'm conscious of it because I don't think of myself as someone who has refined a technique over years and has kind of built up on that. I feel like I'm always coming in a little bit, you know, a tiny bit unsure of what's going to happen. In fact, usually I'm looking for something that is not my initial impetus for making the work. So you have something that gets you beginning a work, and then you're hoping you try to. I think what's consistent for me is I try to get in a place where something. There's a sense of something happening, you know. This. I get a little emotional about this, but there's a sense of being in a place of openness where something can happen, more than having a technique to rely on. You know, it's not really about familiarity, I would say. So what happens there is I work, like you say, through various ways, because I think you want to keep the doors open.
Maybe a certain kind of vulnerability, a certain kind of, I mean, maybe that's why it's emotional, is that it's a certain kind of rawness or certain...
Yeah, probably. Well, I think there's a connectedness. You do feel that, you know, it's not about being famous. It's not about having your work, you know, revered. There is something very personal about trying to have something magical happen, you know, and that's the pursuit that you're involved with.
That also brings me to think about color. I mean, color obviously plays a big part in what you do. Your color combinations are often really surprising, and often teeter, for me at least, on this edge of like, they could go right, they could go wrong. I mean, the works that we see here, they go right. So, like, how do you think about color? Is it something you plan? If you're working on these monotypes, are you thinking about the color ahead of time, or is it more intuitive in the time? Or
well, yeah, they sometimes do go wrong, but those can go right in their own way. I like variety, so I am actually looking to do something perhaps that I haven't done before, and I like a big range of color, so I'm not afraid to try and perhaps come up with some colors that are a little sour or kind of unappealing in a way, because sometimes they're the most beautiful. So I would say I'm open to a lot of different colors, and with the monotypes, the frameworks, it's recent work. I've been working with a printmaker in Long Island City, and he's actually utterly different in his approach from the way I work, but he's also a great, remarkable person, so he's very, and he's worked with a lot of other artists, but for his own work, he really plans things out very carefully and experiments to get what really works best. And I think my approach is to not know what I want and to see what I like. And so we've made 100 works, and some of them perhaps are not successful, but they're not necessarily finished for that matter. You can always try something else on them. But I think, I sometimes in this studio, I'll just walk over to the wall and kind of where all the inks are, and just sort of almost randomly take down some just to try other combinations. So yeah, it's a bit intuitive.
And I like that. Spending time in your studio, I also know that that comment you just made about sometimes if they're not right, they're not finished. I mean, they're basically, I've seen you go back time and time again, and it's a part of your process, right? That sort of revisiting of work, even older work?
Yes, and I don't feel like I've finished with a group of work. I don't feel necessarily, oh, you did a lot of those, that's all behind you. I mean, it might be for a period, but then I could do something in that vein today. So there is a little bit, it feels like a field of work where I can go in different directions, and I don't feel that any of those directions are things I've really put to bed. They're not all come to the end of the line. I feel at any point, and sometimes I go in the studio and I don't really know what I'm going to work on, and even if I was working on something that I could continue on the next day, I might just get distracted from that into something completely different. So I like to leave it very open.
Do you know what's next from working on the Monotypes?
No, I don't really. Well, I think some more. I have been printing some more of my own smaller photos, and I think I'm going to do some more of these annotated drawings. With your curiosity of those, I feel there's something. I have done some more, but I feel like there's some more of those perhaps on the way. Also, a challenge for me is working on color photographs, which I've done a lot less of, because whatever you do on it, it's harder to have the kind of interruption be as evident. When you're working on a black and white photo, it's very strong when you do something on top of it, but with color, everything seems to kind of get absorbed in, and it's harder to see what's been done to the color photo. So I'm actually I've done some, but I'm gonna be working on some color pieces just to see if that might generate something a little different.
Yeah, I can't wait to see those. I'm super curious to see what you do with that. We're talking about a large painting that's off the screen, but it's a double panel, bigger painting. And the question is about what the photograph is underneath it, but also I think it's a little bit a question about negation and like subtraction and what that means. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, it's a pale kind of like a school corridor green, a little bit institutional green. Well, I had, this is 20 years ago, I called these coated drawings, and the word drawing had stuck because I had started calling the annotated drawings on photos drawings, so it somehow drawing on photos stuck. But as they got bigger and bigger, it seemed like perhaps that wasn't the right word. But yeah, the coated drawings were about eliminating perhaps the subject of the photo and leaving these peripheral moments that would be incidental background moments, and just allowing you only a partial view of what was ostensibly the subject. And of course, these ones are quite fluid, because the paint was very fluid enamel on top of the real photo, which has, these were resin-coated photos, so the paint would flow across them, so they were a little bit more fluid and painterly. And yeah, I had a group of pieces like this. This one had never been shown, so Charlotte wisely selected it.
It gets to that conversation we were having about, I think, minimalism, and about sort of telling the viewer in a way what to look at or not look at, and like the pieces behind us where you've given the dumpster in the blue the sort of minimalist sort of, it becomes the sculpture, or the one next to it where it's the background that you've obliterated, and it sort of changes the way in which we look, what to look at, how to look, and sort of taking the photograph out of its photographic quality of looking at something real and sort of telling us what or to look at or not look at, I think is part of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's trying to allow the viewer to approach with their own take on it, and perhaps a little bit of mystery, you know, a little bit of the unknown. Why? What was there that can't be seen, and was it important to begin with or not really? But in another way, it's an excuse to make a painting where you get to start off with something to begin with. So you're not just got the blank canvas. You've got a photo, you know, a beautiful, expensive photo that you then just can paint all over, and it's. Yeah, well, there is something of a helping hand if you already have something there to begin with. So I think that was part of it, and I like this piece because you can see on the edges there are these white lines where there's no photograph that's part of the print. These bars of white, and that's because for larger size photos, I went to a place to have them done, and this was Dugal in New York, and they had a big wall made of metal, and they would actually use magnets that were these bar shapes to hold the paper on the wall, and then they would expose your image on the paper, and these bars were there on the edges, and I like that image, that part of the process, so I kept them in rather than trimming them out.
So the question is about the surprise and the humor and the sort of the how the work gives, you know, it's not what you expect, and it has a sort of playfulness about it, is the question.
I'm going to say absolutely. There's, particularly with street photography, there is a history of people taking these small moments that are found. If you look closely, I would say, there's been Walker Evans and Minor White, perhaps, and of course Richard Wentworth, the British artist, and he used the word happenstance, if I have that right, to describe these kinds of moments that were of human origin. They were these kind of moments where you could see the presence of people, but they were moments where the activity and the objects that were left behind, it was not intentional, very considered. So it was more these happenstance moments that he was probably the one who made that kind of photography very famous. although, like I say, there were predecessors. But so I'm a little bit in that tradition with the street photography, and it turns out now that everyone has a camera with them all the time. It turns out that actually everyone has a bit of this going, and seems to really enjoy this. So, and back to the actual subject of your question, which was humor. Yeah, a lot of those moments are humorous. They are absurd. They are perhaps forgotten, not quite cleaned up, and not quite logical. So those things I am drawn to. But in my sculpture, for instance, I have a group of works where I have a wooden cube. So it's a little bit of a minimal form, and Tony Smith or someone, Richard Serra perhaps, reference. But I put wheels, industrial casters, on all sides, and somewhat randomly, and mismatched wheels. So there's some kind of absurd notion to this quasi-utilitarian object that is humorous. It's sort of trying so hard to be functional that it's actually entirely useless, and that's a kind of dry humor, perhaps, that I like, and there is some of that. I would say in the photos and other parts.
It's a really good point, because I think it's absolutely there. Maybe it's your British dry humor that's snuck into the word, but I think it's. You're taking photographs of really gritty street scenes, and when you think about street photography, it's, you know, you're in the streets of Berlin or the industrial parts of Brooklyn. Those could turn really dark, and yet your work has this lightness, this sort of playfulness, this quality to it that it's remarkable. But it's also, is that natural, conscious?
Well, I think I must enjoy that. I think I must find that something worthy of liking. But yeah, maybe there is a kind of lightness there. Yeah, I should have a more thorough kind of philosophy on that. But I would say, I mean, there is a sense of, you know, we're all here for a short time, really, and we don't really know exactly why, and the more we learn about science and physics, the more peculiar it seems, and therefore there is a wisdom in humor, and I think perhaps that's kind of embedded in these sorts of photos.
That's great. Yeah, so the question is about the kinship to, I think, pretty divergent things, right? So Ajay on the one hand, and sort of Walker Evans, sort of documentary photography, and then Ellsworth Kelly, so sort of like minimalist, colorist sort of things. Yeah, and Ellsworth Kelly's photographs too. Yes, exactly.
Yes, yeah, I like those works. The Ellsworth Kelly photos where he would have the roof of a rural barn that was perhaps a metal roof that was catching the light, and the form was obviously something close to a sculptural form or a painting form he might have made. And with Ajay, the kind of trolling the streets of Paris, there was a little bit of looking behind the curtain, looking at the kind of dirty corner of Paris. I mean, there's also the more serene, the statues in the Tuileries and those kind of works.
Yeah, so the question is about the translucency of the paint that actually it's not fully opaque. I mean, sometimes fully opaque, but often translucent, and that translucency allows us to get a little more information and more references and have sort of, it's sort of like you see under what he's doing in a way. Is that part of the question? Yeah.
Well, not surprisingly, I've done a lot that are a lot of dumpsters that are painted out and other things that are opaque. But it was a process where I started with the annotated drawings, and I was perhaps beginning to draw or use China marker or other things on top of the dumpster form. And then it moved to a point for a long time where I was really just doing these opaque flat shapes and having them be very jarring against the photograph. And then more recently, when I came back to doing some of the photo pieces, these are from 2023, after a long time of not actually working on those, I didn't feel like I had to necessarily follow that rule. It wasn't really a rule, but that process where I'd been really blocking them out. So they went back towards being a bit more translucent and less opaque, like you're seeing on this group. So it has been a fluctuation.
Take one more. Yeah, so the question was about the gestural nature of you see the actual act of painting, which I think kind of differentiates you from somebody more minimalist people. Like, that's putting you more into the realm of abstract expressionism, gestural painting, gestural sort of, which is interesting. I mean, I can't recall having a conversation with an artist where we pull in this many references to this many different kinds of artists, and they all kind of resonate in terms of your process.
Well, I remember at Berkeley when I was, as I said earlier, mainly making paintings, there was one time where I thought to myself, this really sucks, because I would have liked to have been a painter in the late 40s, early 50s. I really would have liked to have been an abstract expressionist painter. But I knew that wasn't really going to be where I was going. But actually, my early influences for works on photographs were Anselm Kiefer, who you probably are familiar with, the large photos, landscape photos, and then he would apply a lot of real materials, tar and hay, and I really loved those back in the 80s. Also, Joseph Beuys, who had a huge array of drawings, but some including photographic aspects, and Kiefer was actually a student of Beuys. So there was, those artists were really very influential. People sometimes say, what about John Baldessari? And I like his work very much, but I feel was a great artist, but I feel we're not of the same approach. Although there's some similarities, you may know he blanked out areas in photographs, but to the point of the question, not really in a gestural way, and more of a kind of calculated conceptual way, which of course worked and made his work great, but I'm not really that kind of an artist. So yeah, for me, paint is a wonderful thing, because it does quickly get out of hand, and I sort of like to work with it on that threshold. And I remember a friend I had at Berkeley from the architecture department, and he tried to do a little painting, and he told me one time, he said, I just can't stand it, the paint is always just getting away from me, and I thought, yeah, that's what I'm interested in, and that's, I think, why I'm now across at the other building.
I love that. I think considering the time, I think that's a good place for us to stop. But thank you for the time. Thank you all for being
Thank
here.
you very much, David, and everyone who's been here.